All right, so welcome everyone to our webinar today about India-Pakistan relations and their future. Our guest today is Michael Kugelman, one of the top experts on the region, probably one of the brightest minds when it comes to talking about the geopolitics of the region. And we're going to start with you, Michael, with kind of walking us through with a kind of a short introduction of how did we get to this point. There was the escalation, the tensions, the exchange of fire, and so on. So if you can walk us through and start with that, and then we'll take it from there with some questions. The floor is yours, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Oren. So thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it, and thanks for the kind introduction as well. This is even a few weeks after the ceasefire. Well, it's actually now been almost a month. It's still important to be having this discussion given the significance of what played out in the region. So, in terms of how we got to where we are, I think it might be useful just to go back a few years. It seems hard to believe, given that India-Pakistan relations are now in very deep tensions, but the relationship was actually in a relatively stable place for more than 4 years leading up to this crisis, and that's mainly because there was a truce, an agreement that was signed between India and Pakistan in early 2021 on the line of control, which of course is the disputed border that bisects India and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And after that truce was concluded, the relationship was fairly stable. Cross-border violence went down significantly. Tensions were lower. That was a an agreement that was mediated by external players, particularly the UAE. And basically, back then, both countries, I think, certainly wanted to reduce violence along the LOC, but they also wanted to be able to focus on other issues that were increasingly concerning, and they didn't want the LOC issue to become something that could become a bigger problem. So yeah, and so if you look 2021 through April 2025, things were pretty good. An indication of just how strikingly stable the relationship was. I mean, you might remember a few years back. A BrahMos missile suddenly was fired from India into Pakistan. And India claimed that it was an error that happened during a routine maintenance incident. Pakistan understandably responded very angrily with a few statements, but then that was it. Nothing happened. Pakistan didn't threaten to retaliate or anything like that. And I think it's an example of how things were back then. But then we get to April 2025 when you had the terrorist attack that set in motion what would come in the weeks later. And I would point to that initially by noting that, if you look at the history of India-Pakistan relations, it does seem that when you have these periods of relative calm, eventually there's a trigger event that plunges relations into crisis again. So in that sense, the fact that we had that 4 years of calm followed by this horrific attack that sparked a serious crisis, not that surprising because it follows the pattern of India-Pakistan relations. So as you all know, the attack itself in India-administered Kashmir and near Pahalgam, it was an especially brutal terrorist attack. Typically, when you have attacks in Kashmir, they target Indian security forces. Rarely do you have a mass casualty attack that targets civilians. And another reason why this one was especially brutal was that it appears to have been communal in nature in the sense that it specifically targeted Hindus. So for all these reasons, it had a particularly traumatic effect on Indians across the board. And so, not surprisingly, that raised significant levels of pressure on the Indian government to respond, to retaliate. And as you all know, India essentially blamed Pakistan for the attack, or it alleged that there were links to Pakistan, that it was linked to Pakistan sponsored terrorism. Pakistan from day one denied any connection or link to this attack, as you all know, but India concluded that there were links to Pakistan. So then some days went by. This was not surprising in that many observers, including myself, thought that India would want to be very careful in terms of how it chose to respond to this attack, in the sense that when you last had a crisis similar to the most recent one in 2019, there was a terrorist attack in India administered Kashmir. India retaliated with airstrikes in Pakistan. And that was significant, that was severely criticized, in that the Pakistanis and many others thought that India actually missed its target and did not hit terrorist targets in Pakistan, and instead basically just hit a bunch of trees. India wanted to be very careful that it would get things right this time, and so it wanted to move slowly, and that's what it did. But then on it was several, I believe it was May 6th, India launched airstrikes in Pakistan. And what was significant about these airstrikes is that they were at greater scale and intensity than anything that we have seen in quite some years. In fact, I would argue that not since the 1971 war between India and Pakistan did you see such strikes. India um, carried out these strikes. They did target Pakistan-administered Kashmir, but they also targeted other parts of they also targeted Pakistan more broadly. And this, I think, reflects a trend that we've seen in recent years when you have these brief military conflicts between India and Pakistan. Both sides have been comfortable using increasing amounts of force. And this is a trend that we saw first in 2016, and 2019, and then 2025. Not surprisingly, Pakistan took these strikes as a provocation. India publicly depicted them as non-escalatory, and that it described them as targeting only terrorist infrastructure, not state infrastructure, not Pakistani military infrastructure, not civilians, and so on. Pakistan, however, claimed that civilians were killed in these attacks, and naturally it viewed these strikes as a provocation. Not surprisingly, Pakistan responded in kind. And then this is where things took a very different direction from what we've seen in the most recent military conflicts between India and Pakistan. You actually had a significant level of escalation, particularly getting into May 9th and May 10th before the crisis wrapped up. You had both countries using sending drones, missiles deep into each other's territory, and so there were a lot of firsts in this case. First of all, this is the first time since 71 when you had so much force used between by India and Pakistan. It's the first time that you've had drones used in combat operations between India and Pakistan. You also had a case where each country was supplementing its use of indigenously produced weaponry with arms from multiple other countries. So India, which for quite some time has been diversifying its sources of arms suppliers, so it's not as much of a surprise, but it was using weaponry from France, from Israel in terms of drones. Um, and Russia, which is, of course, a legacy partner. But what's interesting is that Pakistan, for the first time, introduced Chinese-made jets into its combat operations with India. So the first time Pakistan had done that, Pakistan also used drones that were manufactured by Turkey. So, put together, I would argue that this crisis, this conflict, was not only the most intense in terms of amount of force used since the 71 war, but I would also argue that it was the biggest test of the nuclear deterrent. I mean, as you know, both countries became nuclear formally in 1998. And there was a war since then in 99, the Kargil War, but that was a relatively limited war. I mean, it was a few months, so it was much longer than this most recent crisis, but it was relatively limited. It took place in Kargil, in what was then India-administered Kashmir. Kargil is now a part of the Indian Union territory of Ladakh, but it was geographically contained. Whereas this most recent crisis, you had missiles, drones in both Kashmirs, in different regions of both countries. And so I would argue that it was the biggest test of the nuclear deterrent. I don't think either side intended to really seriously test the deterrent. Both sides have tended to respect the nuclear deterrent. But what we've seen, to refer what I mentioned earlier, is that each country has appeared comfortable to use increasing amounts of force below the nuclear threshold, which I think has implications for moving forward, which we can discuss. Final point I'll make here before I turn things back to you, Oren. Um, India, I think, well, another thing that sets this most recent conflict apart from others India clearly wants to play a long game here. So not only was this a case of India retaliating for a terrorist attack that it blamed on Pakistan with military force, but it took a series of other punitive steps that were not military in nature, including some that had never been done before. So, the fact that it suspended the Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan, very significant. It shut down all trade with Pakistan, even trade through third countries. It shut down the only open land border between the two, and it's made new pitches to try to urge Pakistan's donors to stop providing assistance to Pakistan. This to me suggests that India wants to try to, over the longer term, raise the costs to Pakistan of continuing to provide space and indeed sponsorship for terrorist actors that threaten and indeed target India and Indian interests. And that, I think, suggests that the relationship itself will be in a very difficult place. And going back to the issue of the history of the India-Pakistan relationship, we have seen that after in the past, when there are crises and conflicts, that things do calm down, and we do see cases of cooperation, trade, and so on. But I think that we're going to buck that historic trend in this case. I don't think that India-Pakistan ties are going to calm down. I think that the tensions will remain quite high for quite some time. Happy to discuss why I think that. Back to you.
So there's a lot of questions here which relate to the origin of this conflict, of this clash. And the first one is, how much do we really know? Was it from above to the bottom, kind of like guided by an element within the Pakistani government? And that's a very, when I say government, I mean the military, not necessarily the actual civil government, but the military slash ISI, that actually coordinated or motivated or allow this organization to execute the terror attack. Like, how much do we know that Pakistan officially behind the scenes was actually involved in this?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this attribution issue has been a big part of the discussions about the crisis and the conflict. There is nothing, quite frankly, at least not in the public eye, to indicate that Pakistan's military had a role in this in the Pahalgam attack. Um, many in India have pointed to a speech that the Pakistani army chief made just days before the Pahalgam attack, and in which this is not unusual for a Pakistani army chief. He essentially the phrase he uses that Kashmir is Pakistan's jugular vein, suggesting that it's an essential part of Pakistan. Very critical, harshly critical of India. Again, there's nothing new about this type of thing, but many in India saw the speech as some type of warning of what was to come. But that's not evidence, obviously.
Correct.
India has not provided any evidence, at least not publicly, indicating that there were links to Pakistan. Um, so yeah, now, I mean, there has been some reportage, and here I would counsel caution. A lot of reportage from Indian media outlets during the crisis and the conflict was not credible and turned out to be, in some cases, outright fake. But there had been some reportage indicating that several of the attackers in the terrorist attack were Pakistani nationals. Um, but there's been no more information about that. And also, it's notable that so far as I know, none of those that perpetrated the attacks have been arrested. India has been engaging in search operations in areas near the attack, but so far as we know, no one's been arrested, no one's been caught for the attack. So, I mean, as you probably know, there was a group called the Kashmir Resistance Front, which initially claimed responsibility only to then issue a retraction saying that it never claimed responsibility. India claims that the National Resistance Front is a group that is tied to Lashkar-e-Taiba, which of course is a Pakistan-based, Pakistan-sponsored group, which has carried out a number of attacks previously in India, including the infamous 2008 Mumbai attacks. But Pakistan has claimed that no, that's not true at all. A lot of questions as to what was really going on here, why you have a claim of responsibility followed by, a retraction of that. And there's a difference here between what happened in 2019 and 2016 when you had terrorist attacks carried out in Indian administered Kashmir. In both cases, a group immediately claimed responsibility, and that was Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a known, a very known Pakistani-based and sponsored terror group. But we didn't have that in this case, so this makes things difficult to figure out. And Pakistan has essentially called on India to carry out an investigation. It's offered to help, and so on and so forth, but no indication from India. So many analysts, including myself, think that perhaps there's, India might have evidence, it might have information that it doesn't feel comfortable putting out there publicly, for whatever
Mhm.
reason. But then there's also the issue of historical precedents, right? This idea that because we know that there is a clear historical record, a track record of Pakistan sheltering and sponsoring groups that carry out attacks in Indian administered Kashmir and India more broadly. And also, we know that there are still terrorist actors, terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan that Pakistan has refused to eliminate. And so there's also this idea that, well, then this could be a case of India just assuming that because of these facts, these historical facts, there has to be something to the notion of Pakistani links in this case. But again, so nothing public has been, no, there's been nothing made public by India indicating any links to Pakistan from this horrific attack.
Now, some of the experts from India that I've been in contact said we may not know the smoking gun, but we know who benefited. And that's for us the smoking gun. And the reason why I'm saying that this kind of a statement is because Pakistan is currently going through a domestic crisis, political domestic crisis, which is very unique, even for a country like Pakistan that never had a stable country in its almost entire modern history. So what can you tell us about the current political situation in Pakistan that might have led to something like this to kind of boil and take place?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I've said and others have said that Pakistan's military, including the army chief, are one of the biggest winners from this crisis and this conflict. I mean, that's not to suggest that that's not evidence to indicate that they perpetrated or sponsored this, but they absolutely did benefit. Yeah, so for several years now, we have seen a significant level of anti-army sentiment in Pakistan, which is very unusual. I wouldn't suggest that the army has always been wildly popular in Pakistan. It has not, but it does have what I would describe as somewhat of a sacrosanct image in the sense that it's always been seen as this, this powerful entity that, you really cannot, it's really not to be criticized, that it should be treated with reverence or respect, no matter what you think of it. But what we've seen in recent years is quite striking. A lot of Pakistanis who are publicly criticizing the military and the army chief. A big reason for this is this confrontation between the civilian and military leadership and Imran Khan and his support base. And as you know, Khan is a former prime minister. He's now in jail. He's very popular. He remains. He has a very large support base. He was removed from power in a parliamentary no confidence vote, which he immediately blamed on the Pakistani military for sponsoring. And ever since that, he railed against the military in ways that are very unusual for even other Pakistani political figures who have found themselves on the outs with the Pakistani military. He called out senior military officials, including the army chief by name. Also, keep in mind that Khan and the army chief have a long vendetta going back to when Khan was prime minister. The army chief at that time was the spy chief, the ISI chief, and as I understand it, he had information about Khan's wife, I think, alleging corruption. Khan didn't like that. Anyway, they've always had this vendetta. So that's why, or one reason why Khan has been especially critical of the military, and so the army has responded in kind. All these very rigid crackdowns, clampdowns, and this has really angered the Pakistani public, much of which supports Khan. So bottom line is that the army had been in a tough spot. The civilian leadership as well had not been very popular, had been seen as fairly feckless, not doing enough to address rising concerns, whether you're talking about the economy or rising levels of terrorism. So basically, what this crisis with India brought was an opportunity to unite the country around the civilian and military leadership. There was a very strong rally around the flag effect, helped by the fact that in the view of most, if not all, Pakistanis, Pakistan was being accused for something it didn't do, and it was being punished for something it didn't do. When I say punished, that means Indian airstrikes, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, and so on. And so this essentially brought goodwill and trust back to the Pakistani civilian and military leadership. Another reason how the army in particular benefits uh, this essentially internationalized the issue of Kashmir. I mean, forevermore, Pakistan, not only Pakistani military leaders, but Pakistani leaders of all stripes across many governments have sought to get the world to focus more attention on the Kashmir issue and tried to urge the world to push India to agree to talks with Pakistan. India, of course, doesn't want to go in that direction. Well, what did this attack do? It got the world's attention when it led to this crisis and this conflict. It gave Pakistan the opportunity to say, well, look, this violence and this instability and these tensions between two nuclear armed states is not going to end until we settle the Kashmir issue. Even though I would argue that the Kashmir issue didn't really have anything to do at all with this crisis. It was really the terrorist attack, which happened to occur in Kashmir. But anyway, so essentially, you had an internationalization of the Kashmir issue, which benefits the military as well. These benefits, though, will not necessarily be long term. And I would argue that the fact that the army chief, very soon after the ceasefire that ended the conflict, suddenly received a very unusual and indeed peculiar promotion to field marshal, which has only happened one other time in Pakistan's history. That is actually, I think, that's caused the military to lose some of the goodwill that it gained back, because I think many in Pakistan see this as a case of the top leadership in Pakistan exploiting this crisis and trying to seize even more power than it already has.
Now we kind of entered into long-term game by India, and one of the things that we saw in recent years under Moody's leadership is internationalism really kind of stepping up and taking a more prominent role than ever before. How much do you see that from a long-term driver? So from the perspective that India is basically more and more taking steps for increasing their international status. In Kashmir, we see them more and more taking steps that are more about solidifying their control over the region and so on. How much do you see that as something that currently led to this situation? Not necessarily the terror attack, but this situation, i.e., the escalation, to be so powerful and so strong. And how much do you see this to be something that we're going to see in the future, leading to more such escalations as we've seen? Because from the Indian side, it looks like this is not something that we're going to see a turn back from. It's a kind of a policy which we're going to see more and more, which is Hindu nationalism, basically taking a larger step in Indian politics.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that though whoever carried out these attacks, whoever carried out the Pahalgam attack, it wanted to shatter that narrative that India has been articulating since 2019, when it revoked India-administered Kashmir special autonomous status, and has been making this argument that Kashmir is normalized, it's peaceful, it's stable, there's no more terrorism, and so on. Obviously, you have a horrific terrorist attack that kills tourists in Kashmir, you're going to shatter that narrative. Um, and tourism is becoming a big thing for the regional economy. We've started to see, I mean, mainly not international tourism, but local tourism. We've seen rising numbers of Indians going to Kashmir because of the fact that it had indeed achieved some semblance of stability. Though I certainly wouldn't argue it's normalized when you have such a highly securitized region. And the attack did happen right at the moment when the tourism season was picking up, with the weather having gotten better and so on. So yeah, whoever was behind this wanted to shatter the narrative that Kashmir has been normalized, and also wanted to shatter the tourism industry in Kashmir. But moving forward, looking to what could be coming, I think India is clearly becoming a very a significant power. That's not going to change based on what's happened over the last few weeks. I do think, though, that its relationship with Pakistan is going to remain strained for quite some time, and that does suggest the possibility of another crisis and indeed another conflict. And, if India does have to be looking over its shoulder more, particularly if it fears another terrorist attack or if there's reason to fear that there could be another crisis or conflict, that clearly would distract it from its broader strategic goals of taking the steps it needs to take to grow out its role in the global stage as an economic power and as a rising power on the whole. I mean, that's quite clear. Um, so look, I mean, as I said before, in the past, we have seen conflicts between the two yielding to several years of better relations. I don't think that's going to happen just because the nature of the most recent conflict was so incredibly escalatory, right? I mean, it's going to be difficult to bounce back from that. Not to mention, these non-military punitive steps that India took, shutting down trade, closing the only land border, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, that's really deprived the two of a lot of diplomatic space. So I think that'll make it difficult for them to bounce back as well. Um, you do have communication. I mean, there's a hotline, what's known as a DGMO hotline, and Director General of Military Operations hotline. Senior military official on each side will tap into that. And this is actually quite remarkable that I don't believe that hotline has ever been suspended. It's always been used. Every year it's used. Every conflict, every crisis, even wars between the two, the hotline has been tapped into. So one thing I've been worried about during this most recent conflict, would we get indications that the two sides weren't going to use it? Then all bets would have been off. It is still being used. So this is helpful. And I think that suggests to me that the ceasefire in place now should hold because you will have the DGMOs on both sides resorting to that, which is good. But I think the relationship is going to be in a tough spot. And, it is interesting in that one of the positions that New Delhi has sought to articulate in recent years is that it has Pakistan managed, that it doesn't need to worry about Pakistan, that, it's a terrorist state as India typically the term India uses to describe it, but one that could be managed. But, quite frankly, India's view is that you had this horrific terrorist attack which provoked a pretty significant conflict, and in India's view, it was provoked by Pakistan because Pakistan sponsored the attack that led to the conflict, according to New Delhi. So that suggests that India might need to adjust. It wants to keep its eye on its strategic competition with China for sure. It wants to keep its eye on growing out its economy and strengthening its ties with its neighborhood and the broader region and the broader, the world on the whole. I mean, the Middle East is, of course, a place where India has really been able to grow out its friendships and its relationships. But it is going to be, I think, focused on this Pakistan issue in ways that it had not been earlier. And, final point here, the speech that Prime Minister Modi made soon after the ceasefire, he basically made it clear that, India is ready to go. If, the next time there's an attack, in India, India is going to view that as an act of war. It's not going to give in to Pakistan's nuclear blackmail. It's not going to distinguish between terrorists and their sponsors, suggesting that the next time there's a terrorist attack in India, India might be prepared to launch a war if it feels that that would help advance its goals to deal with this terrorism challenge.
We started to talk about a little bit about the role that the UAE played in previous conflicts, but this ceasefire between the two countries actually came with the help and the basically the process that was led by the United States. I would say that the current administration in the United States most successful ceasefire talks, unlike the Russian ones and between the Russians and Ukrainians, which are not going anywhere, this one actually was successful. So, what can you tell us a little bit about the new old kind of like role that the United States took here in mediating between the two sides?
Right, so there is a long legacy of U.S. governments intervening diplomatically during India-Pakistan crises. I don't mean intervening diplomatically preemptively to try to promote peace or better relations. That's not something we've seen in recent years. That's mainly because the U.S. seeks to defer to the Indian position, which is that these disputes between India and Pakistan are purely bilateral, and there's no need for external involvement. But there has been intervention during actual crises and conflicts. There's a lot of literature on this. You look at Cargill in '99. You look at the 2019 crisis. 2000, the 2001, 2002 crisis, when you had massive military mobilizations along the border. And the common denominator here, it has in the ones that I've mentioned post '98, is U.S. concerns about nuclear escalation risks. I mean, that tends to be why the U.S. gets involved. And so far as I understand, that was the case with this most recent crisis too. And it's interesting, as both President Trump and Vice President Vance earlier on in the crisis basically said, well, this is for them to figure out, right? I mean, Vance famously said that, we're not going to get involved in other countries' wars. Trump had said that, they've had this 1,000-year conflict. They'll figure it out eventually, something like that. Um, but then things changed once the conflicts intensified, and I would argue that you had a few key moments. One of them being when India targeted a very strategic Pakistani airbase in Rawalpindi, the military garrison state in Nur Khan, because first of all, it's a Pakistani airbase, but also it's physically close to the offices and facilities of the Strategic Plans Division of Pakistan, which oversee nuclear command and control issues. So, and there was also some reportage in the New York Times and elsewhere indicating that the U.S. got very concerning intelligence. Not clear what that is, but I suspect it had something to do with nuclear escalation risks. Now, the president, I think, has perhaps overstated the role that the U.S. played in the ceasefire, though I would argue that the Indian government has understated the role that the U.S. Played. India's position is that the U.S. basically had nothing to do with the ceasefire. Trump's position is that the U.S. essentially was responsible for it. As I understand it, what happened is that throughout the crisis, even earlier on, the State Department had been engaged. Marco Rubio was in touch with his counterparts in India and Pakistan several times, pushing for de-escalation. But after those concerns about nuclear escalation risks grew, that's when you had senior U.S. officials, mainly Rubio and Vance, essentially pushing the two sides to start looking for off ramps. And India and Pakistan were then prepared to start negotiating. I do not believe, so far as I understand, that the U.S. was actually mediating the talks between India and Pakistan that led to the ceasefire. The final point I'll make is that even though the conflict had grown increasingly scary and concerning during those final hours, I'd argue that India and Pakistan were actually at a point where they felt they could claim victory and sell that victory to their to audiences back home. I mean, India had done a lot of damage to Pakistan. It had hit air bases in Rawalpindi, whereas Pakistan, even though India hadn't yet admitted this at the time. Pakistan had shot down a number of Indian jets, which is a pretty significant win for Pakistan. So I think that both sides didn't necessarily need the U.S. to be pushing them, even though that might have helped move the needle forward a bit. So what I'm saying is that the Trump administration did follow this historical pattern of the U.S. intervening diplomatically during these India-Pakistan crises, but I don't think that the U.S. actually was actively mediating the talks that led to the ceasefire.
So we see that the U.S., if I can kind of look at it from a perspective of like the future of the relations between India and Pakistan, we see that the U.S. is taking a role which is historically took, but the current administration wouldn't like to expand that, and they would like to step back if they could. But we did see two actors. We have seen them before, but they were really really active this time around. Primarily when we look into Pakistan, first one is China, which is I'm going to ask about that separately. But I want to start actually with Turkey. Turkey took a very, very strong, basically siding to with the Pakistanis. They were not trying to be diplomatic about it. And the question here is, what do we see from this? What can we learn about this? I mean, there is the question about what is Turkey trying to achieve, but that's for another webinar and another discussion. But what do we see about that kind of a relationship that we see between Pakistan and Turkey, and the fact that Turkey took such a strong a strong statement siding Pakistan in this, not worrying about India and the consequences of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, we talk so often about Pakistan's close ties with China and Saudi Arabia and other Arab Gulf actors, but less so Turkey. This is a very important relationship. I'd argue that it's one of these rare no drama relationships where you really don't have key tension points. You don't really have flare-ups and tensions. You don't have awkward moments. It's long been a very close relationship, which is notable given that Turkey is a NATO country, among other things, and you know Turkey has never publicly opposed Pakistan's position on Kashmir, which is also even I mean even Pakistan's closest allies like Saudi Arabia have at times pushed back on Pakistan's position on Kashmir, and that's in part because you know some of Pakistan's closest friends are also good friends with India. I mean, that's certainly the case with the Saudis. Turkey, though, has a very fraught relationship with India, and I think that and partly that could be reflected in geopolitical issues. I'm not an expert on Greece-Turkey relations, but my understanding is that Greece and India actually have some interesting ties going on there and have for some time. But yeah, I mean, I think Turkey has felt empowered to really put itself out there as one of the few countries, along with China, though not always, and a few other countries willing to uh, openly advocate for Pakistan's interests on the world stage. Now, the fact that you know Pakistan is now using Turkish weaponry in its combat operations with India, that's pretty significant, and I think that says something about how the relationship has evolved to this point. But yeah, Turkey's relationship with India is a pretty difficult one, and we've seen the reaction in India since it became known that Pakistan was using Turkish drones. These very populist type narratives calling for Indians to stop going to Turkey as tourists. I don't think Turkey is a hugely popular spot for Indian tourists, but at any rate, that I think is notable. But yeah, I think the final word here is that one of India's longstanding goals with Pakistan is to isolate it regionally, but also globally. But I think that this close friendship that Pakistan has with Turkey is another indication of how difficult it is for India to succeed in that regard of trying to isolate Pakistan just because of the fact that Pakistan it doesn't have a huge number of friends, but the friends that it does have, quite a few of them are pretty impactful global actors, whether you're talking about China or the Saudis, many, if not all, of the Arab Gulf states, and indeed Turkey as well.
So we spoke about how within Pakistan, politically, the military and the leadership benefited from the conflict and how it ended. But another beneficial side to this conflict was China. And China's weapons industry definitely benefited from it. What can you tell us about China's relations with Pakistan, and how are they involved? How are they likely to evolve post this conflict? So we know there's a very strong relations that are economic relations, obviously supplying weapons, but post this conflict and the success that some of the Chinese weaponry had in the battlefield, what are we likely to see between the relationship between those two countries, China and Pakistan?
Yeah, it's interesting that getting to your point about how Pakistan's military benefited from this conflict, in the weeks, really in the months before the conflict, Pakistan-China relations were seeing some strain, mainly because China was very concerned about security risks to its investments and its interest more broadly in Pakistan. And as you know, China invests very heavily in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the Pakistan component of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there have been a number of terrorist attacks in recent years targeting Chinese investments and indeed Chinese nationals. And China was growing increasingly frustrated that Pakistan was unwilling to or was incapable of addressing those concerns, to the point that China had started to push for Pakistan to allow it to bring in its own armed security forces into Pakistan to protect its nationals, which is something that is illegal in Pakistan. You could have foreigners can have security presences in Pakistan, but they're not allowed to be armed. Now, how could you have a security presence if it's not armed? At any rate, so there have been some pretty notable tensions between Pakistan and China. And the broader issue is that CPEC had been losing momentum. China was uncomfortable investing, and Pakistan didn't want to take any more investments given its economic situation. So things were a bit tricky. And at the same time, India had been very quietly but notably pursuing a bit of a détente with China. There was a border deal between India and China last year, and then there were a number of other agreements. One of them was to resume direct air flights. So it's sort of interesting, direction that was being taken that Pakistan was not happy about. But then, with this crisis and conflict, what happened? Well, you have Pakistan attacked by India, and Pakistan is able to, for the first time, draw on Chinese-made weaponry. And I think that was clearly a reminder to both China and Pakistan about how important their relationship is. It was a wake-up call to India of the risks of trying to ease its own tensions with China, given that China is arming Pakistan, and Pakistan is using those arms against India directly. So this all redounds to Pakistan's benefit. This is not to say that India would not still want to look to efforts to try to ease tensions with China to the extent that it can. It's not to say that Pakistan is not going to continue to see tensions in its relationship with China. This resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan is very real, and that continues to be a threat to China. But I do think that for now, I think India has recognized the dangers of trying to reconcile a bit with China, and I think that Pakistan and China have both been reminded that despite their strain in their relationship, they both really need each other, and that they have this military alliance that certainly helps serve their interests, and particularly those of Pakistan.
And if we look into the relation that Pakistan has with China in terms of the military relations, do we see a situation where Pakistan is basically kind of withdrawing from its um, I would say, a strong security relationship they had with the United States? Pakistan has F-16s, for example, so they definitely have a very strong security relationship to receive those and to maintain those. But do we see a situation where Pakistan basically kind of withdraws from it and move into the Chinese side as a result of basically saying that, you know what, we can get those kind of high quality weapons from the Chinese. We don't really need the United States as we needed them in the past. And the United States may not see Pakistan as much of a strategic partner as they see them in the past. Now, when we're in a post-Afghanistan withdrawal kind of a situation, so how much do you see that kind of a thing evolving, in which we're going to see Pakistan essentially becoming a much more strategic partner of China over and the expense of the United States and to the resent of the United States?
Yeah, I would argue that here in Washington, many are already of the view that Pakistan is in China's camp, and that contrary to Islamabad's pledge to balance its good relations with both China and the U.S., it's actually in China's camp comfortably. And one could make an argument for that, but yeah, I think that the Trump administration, I don't really think is interested in a deep security partnership with Pakistan. It was, of course, the first Trump administration that suspended most security aid to Pakistan, and that remains in effect. The only really notable development in U.S.-Pakistan security cooperation in recent months has been the Trump administration's decision, I think it was back in February, to um, free up about $400 million to allocate to a program meant to monitor that US-made F-16s in Pakistan are not used against India, that they're used for counterterrorism purposes. And I think that, quite frankly, is sort of highlights the incentive that Pakistan has to work more closely with China's military. And so, Pakistan used Chinese-made jets in this recent conflict with India for the first time against India. It'll have even more reason to do that, given that the U.S. clearly is making efforts to make it, is less likely, and it wants to try to prevent Pakistan from using its American-made jets against China, against India. And these are very prestigious craft, these F-16s that the U.S. has provided to Pakistan over the years. And for the U.S. to be saying, well, no, use them, but not against India, I think that poses a challenge for Pakistan. So that I think is definitely a reason to believe that Pakistan would want to work more closely with the Chinese. Now, Pakistan does have other military partners, right? We've already talked about Turkey, but my sense is that at this point in time, Pakistan can't rely on these types of jets that from anyone more than it can China, given that the U.S. is not going to be as much of a player. But not to say that the U.S. wouldn't be game for some security cooperation with Pakistan, but I think it would be very narrowly focused around counterterrorism issues, particularly, cases of terrorists, mainly with Islamic State, Khorasan, that pose a threat to the U.S. and that are based in Pakistan. We already saw earlier this year that the U.S. and Pakistan actually helped work together to apprehend an ISK terrorist that, according to the U.S., was involved in the horrific attack in Kabul during the U.S. withdrawal that killed a number of American soldiers. There is a counterterrorism dialogue between the U.S. and Pakistan that plays out. The next round will probably be in the next few months, but this is fairly, this is a fairly modest degree of cooperation. So, yeah, I think that we will see, given that the relationship between India and Pakistan remains tense. Given the signaling coming from the Indian government about, the next time this happens, we're ready. That's going to get Pakistan even more concerned. So I think naturally we'll want to turn to China even more. But it'll be interesting to see how does Beijing react to that. I mean, the Pakistan-China relationship has always been one driven by Pakistan's, need for Chinese assistance. That gives China leverage. China continues to be concerned about these terrorism threats that it faces in Pakistan with its assets. Would it use, if it knows that Pakistan is going to make a pitch for even more Chinese arms, would that make Beijing try to renew that pitch to Pakistan about perhaps letting it bring in its own security forces into Pakistan to protect its Chinese nationals in Pakistan? Just speculation, but we'll see how that plays out.
So one of the tools in the arsenal that Pakistan had in the past were those groups. You mentioned some of them before, from the ones that are operating in Kashmir to the ones that actually carried the attacks in Mumbai almost 20 years ago, but still. And then we kind of saw a relatively a period of time where those groups were kind of not being used anymore. They're not being we don't see any attacks coming out of them, and in a way, basically, the Pakistani government enforcing on them to sit low. But this terror attack happened, and a lot of the questions are we seeing a U-turn in the policy? Are we seeing now a Pakistani policy, which is basically saying we are kind of like, let's reignite it again. Let's see if we can start using those groups again against India in order to achieve some of our goals. Do you see any way that this is maybe something that we're going to see more of in the future? More of those groups being operating, more of those groups basically being allowed to operate by Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, there is a history of Pakistan trying to keep a tight leash on these groups when that serves its interests. And, whenever there's increased pressure from the international community, particularly most recently looking at the Financial Action Task Force, a terrorist financing watchdog, which essentially listed Pakistan and said that it had to do more to target terrorist financing, and it did address that, so far as I know. But now that it's off the so-called FATF gray list, that's not to say that it can't sort of roll, sort of loosen those constraints that it had put on some of these groups and some of these actors. And certainly, I mean, one of the main reasons why Pakistan has cultivated these violent actors to start with, at least in an Indian context, is because of the nature of its fraught relationship with India, and it has viewed these non-state actors as really, I guess, an asymmetric tactic, so to speak, to push back against what is traditionally been India's conventional its superiority with conventional force. Though I would argue that there is more parity than some people give Pakistan credit for, particularly in the LOC, as we saw in the recent conflict. But Pakistan has looked to cultivate ties with these actors to try to hit out at India. Given the nature of the relationship, given how India has responded, given the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, these other efforts to try to tighten the to really put the squeeze on Pakistan, so to speak, to raise the cost to Pakistan of not doing more to target these terrorist infrastructure, there is a chance, I think, there is a risk for India that Pakistan would respond by essentially doubling down on the very policies that have upset India to start with, and that could include giving more free rein to militants. But honestly, many of these terrorist actors, I mean, they have agency, right? I mean, they could do things on their own. They don't necessarily need Pakistan to order them about, so to speak. And one thing that I worry here in particular, talking about the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, which essentially gives India the ability over time to build dams and do other things that could prevent water from flowing into Pakistan, a very water insecure country, even in the best of times, exacerbated by climate change and so on. Some years ago, Lashkar-e-Taiba would had this narrative that basically said that India is stealing Pakistan's water, and they're essentially threatening attacks in India based on that. Haven't heard that narrative as much from LET in recent years, but now that India has suspended this treaty, I think that LET would have more ammunition, so to speak, no pun intended, but it would essentially have, a new opportunity to say, well, look, this is what India is doing. We're going to avenge this. So there is the risk that the actors, the militant actors themselves could be galvanized and emboldened. And it's one thing that we've learned that Pakistan might try to control its assets, but it can't always control them. And so, that's an added risk as well.
So we're entering the last 10 minutes of our webinar, and I want to go into the strategic question, which is what's next for the India-Pakistan relations from a perspective which kind of emerged during this conversation, which kind of makes me a little bit concerned because you said something very interesting. You said both sides see themselves victorious in this conflict, which means in a way they're not afraid to re-engage in a conflict like that because they can see the benefits and they see that they can gain from it, and they kind of lost the fear factor in a way, or if it's not lost, at least it's kind of a little bit it's weaker than it was before. So looking ahead, the fact that this happened could indicate that we are actually more likely to see a conflict like this emerging. The fact that the escalations are becoming more aggressive and more volatile, um, it, with this kind of a statement, where do you think we're heading? Are we heading to a more volatile, more aggressive, more conflicts and clashes such as this emerging with the obvious risk of a total war? Or do we see the fact that this happened and both sides kind of were able to back down and recalculate course as actually a positive side of this may not be happening again as soon as we might think?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, the ceasefire is fragile, but it's holding, and India has made clear, through the speech that Modi gave, that it has no intention of restarting hostilities unless there's an attack in India. I mean, I think Modi's message seemed to be to leave no doubt in the mind of Pakistan that if there's an attack, if there's a terrorist attack in India, India is going to respond. And we've heard that the language that India's government has used to describe the ceasefire is different from what Pakistan and the US have used, which describe it as something more stable. I think India is described as essentially as an understanding, not a formal ceasefire. But at any rate, I think India is ready to move on for now. It has other priorities. It wants to focus on other issues, and so on. Pakistan, it's harder to say. I mean, I don't think that Pakistan would like to see a resumption of a scenario where Indian missiles are flying into Pakistan, especially with India having said that in the future it's not going to distinguish between terrorists and their sponsors, suggesting that the next time India targets, it could go after state targets, military, government, whatever the case may be. Um, but I think here, if we look at the pattern, it tends to be an attack, a terrorist attack that triggers these crises. Um, Here this gets to the attribution issue, right, that we were talking about before. There have been a number of attacks in India and India-administered Kashmir, India more broadly, that are, just local, cases of local militants staging attacks. So, it's not unusual for this to happen. Indeed, over the last few years, we have seen less militancy, less terrorism in India-administered Kashmir, but certainly there could be, there could be an attack that has nothing to do with Pakistan. It could be aggrieved militants that decide to take aim at some target. The implication from New Delhi is that anything, no matter what, no matter how it looks, we'll get a response in Pakistan. So that suggests to me that the bar, I mean, it wouldn't take much. It would take very little for there to be a new crisis. And we've certainly gone past the point where we would actually ask the question, well, if India stages strikes in Pakistan, would Pakistan respond? Of course it would. Absolutely, it would respond. And given what we saw with this most recent crisis, they went so high up the escalation ladder that suggested the next conflict will entail the two countries being comfortable going, climbing up the ladder very quickly from the start. And that then raises questions about, how much higher are they willing to go within that nuclear threshold that'll get the international community's attention. So short answer to your question is I don't necessarily think we're going to see another crisis anytime soon, but I do think that there will be another one eventually, and when it happens, it could be quite a serious one.
So that kind of lead me to the last question, which is we kind of like to conclude all of our webinars asking the question, which is if you can give me very briefly in very briefly like three scenarios: one best case, worst case, and a black swan scenario. And I actually want to start with the black swan scenario. It's a more creative one, but what would you say? And it doesn't have to be negative, by the way. What would you say could be a black swan scenario or an unpredicted scenario that could evolve when we're looking into the India-Pakistani relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think a logical black swan would be India triggering a conflict, such as sending military forces into Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Highly unlikely, but we're talking about black swans, right?
Mhm.
Highly unlikely, but as we've seen, I mean, the Modi government has said Kashmir is off the table, doesn't want to discuss Kashmir, except if it's about POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the part of Kashmir administered by Pakistan. So I don't think that's likely, but I mean, there's been a lot of threats coming from Indian government in recent years. It intends to take it back, so to speak. So that would be the black swan I identify. I don't think it's likely, but if it happened, you'd have a pretty serious conflict. Though I would argue that if you want to, I mean, it's hard to be positive when thinking about India-Pakistan relations these days. If you want a positive black swan, it would be that somehow the two sides agree to some type of comprehensive dialogue that leads to some type of understanding, which realistically would be an acceptance of the status quo, essentially formalizing the line of control. I don't think either side is ready for that, which is again why I see this as a black swan. But yeah, those are the two scenarios that come to mind in that regard.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to be concluded this webinar. Very interesting, very fascinating. But I want to thank you, Michael, for the analysis. I want to thank you for the insights, and I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great conversation.